Thank you, Cherie. I thought she was going to say the real parallel, that like Martin Luther, I owe everything to my wife. That's the real. But she was not a nun. Far from it. It's a real delight to be. A real delight to be back in the Trinity Forum again and to be with you all. When she said it was sold out, you could sell out a telephone kiosk in 5 minutes. So this is not exactly the press club at short notice, but it's a real delight to be with you again. As Cherie said, I was born in China and grew up in the ancient Ming capital of Nanking, or Nanjing as it is today. Nanking had been brutalized by the rape of Nanking in 1937. It had suffered incredible privations in World War II, and it was threatened by the looming army of Lin Biao and the communist troops. But despite all that it had gone through, you could see the majesty of its past. Magnificent city walls, wonderful tree-lined avenues, and the incredible Ming tombs. In 1500, Nanking was the capital of the most powerful, prosperous city in the world. The Ming emperors were powerful, wise, and could afford to be expensive. They sent a fleet to Africa with ships 4 times the size of Columbus's. They sent 1 million men to build the 100,000 buildings that became the Forbidden City in Beijing. No one in their right mind in 1500 would ever dream that China would be rivaled, let alone eclipsed and dominated, by what they considered a cultural backwater way off in the west, off the rocky landmass of Asia. But of course, that's what happened. And suddenly, Europe eclipsed and dominated China, and then the West, and then America, and many other parts of the West. And as the Chinese, after those centuries of humiliation, regained their power, they raised the question, rather like a certain lady recently, what happened? And there was a famous discussion at the Chinese Academy of the Social Sciences, and they asked how on earth could China have been overtaken by the West? Was it Western guns? No. Was it Western politics? Partly, but not really. Was it Western economics? Again, partly, but not fully. And their conclusion at the end of the discussion, it was in fact Western religion, the Christian faith. But at that point, some Jewish scholars jumped into the argument and said, that's accurate, but not precise enough. Because if you think, the Christian faith had been dominant in Europe since the 4th century when Theodosius declared Rome Christian, but had not dominated the world. What was it that suddenly took Europe to its position as a dominant power in modernity? And the Jewish scholars pointed out, it was in fact not the Christian faith in general, but the Reformation in particular. The Reformation in particular. And historians now say at the 500th anniversary that the Reformation, for better or worse, gave the single strongest set of ideas that has made the modern world what it is, although in many cases with unseen consequences, with unknown aftermaths, and in ways that would have surprised the reformers themselves. Now, of course, there were many Reformations. Before the Reformation, within the Reformation, and of course the Counter-Reformation was a Reformation. The Reformation made incredible impact on certain key areas, but also had amazing blind spots. And I'm not tonight trying to give an overall balanced picture of the Reformation, which of course needs to be done. Many people simply lament the divisions. Others have pronounced the Reformation over. And many have just concentrated on the internal gifts of the Reformation, the rediscovery of the gospel, the restoration of the place of the Bible, the new re-emphasis on lay people and things like this. But I want to focus on some of the so-called gifts of the Reformation to the wider cultural world that were powerful in shaping the West, and one in particular. If we had time, I think you could itemize at least 6, as they put it, major C's, things beginning with C, that all had an incredible impact on the modern world. But looking at this country, there are clearly 3 above all others. Calling, and its immense influence on purpose and dynamism and entrepreneurialism, possibly even the rise of capitalism, and certainly a leading motif in the errand into the wilderness that was the Puritan sense of purpose in coming here. The second C would be conscience. The first references to religious freedom are in the early church. Tertullian, Lactantius, who happened to be the tutor to the Emperor Constantine's son, so probably behind the Edict of Milan. But it was actually the Reformation, and people like Thomas Howells and Roger Williams, Isaac Backus and John Leland, who picked up that sense of conscience, and it has developed, with a great deal of help from America, into human rights. But I want to focus on the third one, which I believe is one of the secrets to understanding the rise of the United States, but also, not just looking at the past, one of the keys to understanding what we need to see renewed and restored today. And that's the third C, the notion of covenant. Covenant. Because what many Americans don't realize, covenant is the source of constitution. It isn't actually the social contract. That came later. Covenant is the source of the Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution is, in effect, a nationalized, somewhat secularized form of Jewish covenant, with a bit of history in between. So let me pick up this discussion. All of the points I'd like to make you can expand on in far greater depth, but at least to give you some sense of this discussion. First of all, consider the place of covenantalism in political theory. Anyone talking about politics immediately settles on the Greek, Roman, classical way of understanding things. You have different types of government. Monarchy, the rule of one, corrupted easily into tyranny. Aristocracy, the rule of the few and the excellent, easily corrupted into oligarchy. And of course, democracy, the rule of the people, easily corrupted into the rule of the mob. And as the Greeks understood, the wheel is always turning. So it's not that you choose one and you have it forever. Life goes on, time passes, things change, the wheel turns, and between them they shift around in a certain way. But about 50 years ago, a Jewish scholar, Daniel Elazar, argued that while that was a very important way of understanding governments, we should also look at what he discussed as the founding of societies and the nature of societies themselves. And seen that way, you have a different 3. Some societies are organic. They are linked by blood and kinship, rather like an African tribe or a Scottish clan. Organic societies, obviously with modern mobility and various things, fewer today than in the past. The second and the most common type of societies are hierarchical, linked by power and force and conquest, such as a kingdom or an empire. One could think of the Roman Empire and many, many others. But the third type of society, both in its foundings and its character, are the covenantal, shaped by a common binding agreement to the people, of which the 3 most famous are the Jews, the Swiss, going back to their Articles of Confederacy in the 13th century, and of course, the United States, we the people. How did covenantalism shape history? Well, very obviously, it is absolutely decisive in Jewish history. If you think for a minute, the Jews had a covenantal society centuries before they had a monarchy. And importantly, centuries after they lost the monarchy and the capital city and the land itself and priests and prophets, it was covenantalism which held them together. And if you go back into Jewish history and look at the extraordinary disasters of the year AD 70 under the Roman Emperor Titus, and then AD 133 under Hadrian, the rabbis even suggested, with more than 1 million Jews murdered then, that Jews should stop having sexual intercourse and the family of Abraham should die out. Other rabbis, of course, disagreed. And what kept them together was the Torah, and at the heart of the Torah, the covenant. The world that they'd known had gone, but the word that was decisive in their lives remained. As they put it, the Torah and the covenant, they carried, but it carried them. And Heinrich Heine, the great German poet, said, the Torah was the portable homeland of the Jewish people. And however terribly they were persecuted, and we who are followers of Jesus have to say with sorrow, it was often by us. And to whatever lands they were scattered, it was the covenant and the Torah which held them together. And the survival of the Jews is one of the miracles of history. And at the heart of it is that notion of covenant. The second great period is the period of the Reformation. You think how Calvin taught covenant. Zwingli taught covenant even more. John Knox expanded on covenant, and they became in Scotland the Covenanters. And the Scottish word for covenant is actually Whigamore, which gave rise to the later word Whig, people who believed in freedom. Oliver Cromwell describes the covenant and Exodus as the only direct parallel that he was pursuing in the English Revolution. Now, of course, any of you know history know that the English Revolution failed. The king came back. And the historians refer to it as the lost cause. But of course, what was the lost cause in England became the winning cause in New England. And William Bradford, his Mayflower Compact, was a covenant. John Winthrop on the Arbella preached a sermon that was a covenant. And you can see in the history of New England, covenantalism was at the heart of marriages, the heart of churches, at the heart of townships, and then, of course, at the heart of the states. So the Constitution of Massachusetts is the oldest written covenant in the world still existing, and it shaped Massachusetts. And of course, with the help of John Adams, who wrote it, it later became the U.S. Constitution in the 18th century. Now, of course, as we'll come to, we're a long way from there. But what was it about covenantalism that was so powerful? There were, of course, other covenants in history. The Hittites, in the same region as the Hebrews, they had their suzerainty treaties, usually with a dominant king and a subservient king. Alexander the Great had his Corinthian League, which was something of a covenant. Those of us, like I am from Ireland, coming from Celtic backgrounds, many of the Celtic societies were oath communities. There were other covenants. And of course, even in the Bible itself, there are other covenants. The covenant with Noah after the flood, and the covenant beginning in the middle of Genesis with Abraham as a family. But the covenant at Sinai is distinctive. It's the first time that God is a partner in a particular way. And it's a covenant with all the people. Now, immediately you've got to think of Greece. Many Americans look back to Athens. But if you think in Athens, democracy and all that, only 20% of the men could vote. And certainly not the women, and not the children, and not the foreigners. But in Israel, the covenant is with the men, the women, the children, those alive and those yet to be born, because there's an intergenerational project of God with all the people, with no exceptions. And of course, the Sinai covenant, unlike all the others, is comprehensive in covering almost the whole of life. So the Hittite covenants, for example, are very narrow, like often you want a legal contract to be. You don't want to be tied down in too many places. But the Jewish covenant covers all sorts of things, from business and farming and all sorts of things. But it wasn't those features that put a stamp on history. It was three other things. First, if you read Exodus carefully, it was a matter of freely chosen consent. 3 times it says in the text, the people say, all that the Lord says, we will do. They sign on. As Michael Walzer at Harvard, who followed Daniel Elazar, remarks, it was a wholesale commitment, everyone signing on. That is the origin of the consent of the government. All that the Lord says, we will do. And as the rabbis point out, even when the master of the universe offers a covenant, it is only ratified when everyone there signs on together. Freely chosen consent. Secondly, it was a matter of a morally binding pledge. Many of the other covenants were, as I said, very narrow, much more like a modern legal contract. Keep it narrow, keep it specific. You don't want to be tied down everywhere. No, it's very comprehensive, and that moral dimension is very powerful. The Jews point out again, the rabbis make a lot of this, that there are 613 commands in Exodus and through the Torah. But remarkably, there is no Hebrew word for obey. Like, say, the Islamic word for submission, the very word Islam, submission. There isn't one. The closest is the word Shema, which has the idea of paying focused attention and acting accordingly, but has built into it the idea not just of physical hearing, but of hearing, deliberating, deciding, and then signing on. So it becomes obedience, perhaps, but it's a matter of a free person's fully committed obedience, a morally binding pledge. And the third thing, perhaps most crucial of all, a matter of reciprocal responsibility of all for all. In other words, you have the 3 musketeers in a huge form, all for one and one for all. Or as the Jews put it, every Jew responsible for every Jew. One rabbi said there wasn't one covenant, there was 600,000 covenants. And when he said that, another rabbi immediately chimed in. There wasn't 600,000, there was 600,000 times 600,000. Work that one out. As each of them was making a covenant to the Lord and to each other. Every Jew responsible for every Jew. And of course, that's the context for the famous ethical principle, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if we read the Torah, that is said once and has an incredible impact on history. But 36 times it said that you should love, care, look after the stranger with the same responsibility, because you were strangers once, and so on. In other words, again, as the rabbis put it simply, the stranger, unlike, say, the Greek, who viewed the stranger as the barbarian, this babble of a different language, they're not us. And Aristotle says, we should only care for, quote, people like us. No, says the Torah. We care for the stranger too. The stranger, with his foreign language or a different face or whatever, may not be in our image, but the stranger is still in God's image, and therefore that reciprocal responsibility of all for all applies. Now you can see immediately, and I'm not buying the contrast at this point, think of democracy. democracy has zero social content. Zero social content. It just says who's supposed to be the ruler, and even that is called into question under modern conditions, but zero social content. Whereas the heart of covenantal republicanism is a view of public life of responsible relationships. Relationships precede regimes. Society precedes the state. It's families, schools, neighborhoods, communities. These are the critical things, and if they're living well, then you have a healthy society and a vibrant nation. And you get it that way around, not the other. What are some of the strengths and weaknesses of covenantalism? Well, every system, think of the Greeks again, monarchy, democracy, aristocracy, they all have strengths, they all have weaknesses. That's why the wheel turns. And the Bible, of course, is very, very realistic. There's no photoshopping in the Bible. You read most of the great classics like Homer, and you have heroes who are airbrushed, heroes who are photoshopped. Never in the Torah. An incredible realism, sibling rivalries, murders, all sorts of things. But what are the strengths and weaknesses of covenantalism as a way of founding and then running a society? And you can see them in the Scripture. First, and you can see these apply to us today if you think of the applications, but I'm not applying it. First, the strength of it, and we can see this in history, it is covenantalism which links faith and freedom. Now, I say that as an Englishman living in your wonderful country, and I'm aware in many, many discussions on Capitol Hill around the universities, there are words like the F words, faith, freedom, family. They just roll off the tongue at certain times, particularly on the 4th of July, and you think they've lived together forever. They haven't. Do any of you remember reading Tocqueville at school or university? Tocqueville comes as a Frenchman from Catholic France that had just experienced the French Revolution. And you remember in his introduction, Democracy in America, he says, in Europe and for most of history, those who loved religion fought liberty, and those who loved liberty fought religion. What's he referring to? For 1,500 years, since the Emperor Theodosius, you'd had various branches of state churches. In other words, the church in Europe was not covenantal. It was hierarchical. As historians put it, the church, when it predominated, copied Greek ideas and Roman institutions somewhat uncritically. So the papacy and the Caesars have a lot in common. And the church in Europe, in various branches, was hierarchical, not covenantal. Now, the significance of that is simple. When hierarchical societies, which are founded on power and conquest, when they are corrupted, they become oppressive. Now, you think of the greatest saying on power in English-speaking history, all power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and we know that was said by a Catholic layman commenting on his own church. Actually, he opposed papal infallibility for that very reason, and he made the famous comment, they came into the enclave as shepherds and went out as sheep. And he didn't like what was happening because he saw that when power is corrupted, it not only oppresses the weak, that's the obvious problem of power, it corrupts the powerful. And that's the far more subtle and dangerous thing. So the church had not been covenantal. And it was the Reformation bringing together faith and freedom through the notion of covenant that for the first time in European history and Western history made faith and freedom one. And Tocqueville says, in Europe, they're fighting each other. And I come to this country, and the first thing you see is the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty go hand in hand. Never take that for granted. It's rare, and it's an achievement And it came directly from Covenantalism. You have the same thing in Edmund Burke, a great Irish orator and statesman. Burke defended the American colonies stoutly in the House of Commons. And he said, in effect, you MPs should not have been surprised by what you're seeing in America. Why? These people who went to America are, as he put it, the Protestants of Protestantism. Or as he said later, they were the dissenters of dissent. They loved freedom, and they brought together faith and freedom in this distinctive way. The contrast, of course, was with France. I often quote the remark of Diderot, the encyclopedist, which is picked up by the Jacobins, the radicals in the streets. We will never be free until the last king is strangled with the guts of the last priest. A little gory, but you get the point. Church and state were one. Throne and altar were in collusion. They were both powerful, both corrupt, both oppressive. The revolution did what? Threw off both. And the French system is called laïcité, the strictest European separation of church and state, because it was against the corruptions of oppressive state churches. It's not my principal point tonight, but one of the ironic consequences of both the Catholic influence and the Protestant influence in Europe is to produce the most secular societies in the world. But the Catholic influence had been, such was the corruption and the oppression for people, supremely in the French Revolution, but elsewhere, to say, we have no desire for God. Militant anti-clericalism. Protestantism was somewhat different, but equally deadly. They produced modern capitalism, prosperity, in such an extraordinary way that people say we have no need for God. Science, capitalism, the market, and all these things, we have no need for God. And ironically, both the Catholic consequence and the Protestant consequence end up roughly the same in Europe, with an incredibly secular continent at the present time. But that's the great gift of the Reformation, bringing together faith and freedom. What's its great weakness? The Bible's clear about that. A covenant is a matter, I said, of a solemn binding agreement. But here's the problem. God keeps his word. Humans don't. Nietzsche discusses it, if you ever read his Genealogy of Morals. We are the animal entitled to make promises, he says, but we don't. And you can see a discussion down through history as well as in the Bible itself. So it's not long after Exodus that you read Judges, where there's no king in Israel and everyone's doing what was right in their own eyes. And clearly it had all fallen apart. Humans don't keep promises well. The Lord does, we don't. Now, there's a lot of discussion of that. Machiavelli, for instance, believed that solidly. And if you've read The Prince, he says the prince doesn't need to keep a promise. Whatever he said yesterday is totally unbinding in what he does today, because today's imperative is all that matters. So promise keeping is irrelevant. And you see people like David Hume, John Locke, and others, and Joe may bring this up too, discussing that in their turn. But you can see the central problem. Humans don't keep promises well. Now, that's incredibly important today. Think of all the discussion of the breakdown of trust in American institutions, or the breakdown of trust in business, and so on. It's by promise keeping, and here Nietzsche is quite clear about this, it's by promise keeping that we build trust. And I don't just mean marriage contracts and covenants, although that's one of the biggest, but I mean simple things. I'll see you tomorrow for lunch. I'll see you at 9, and I turn up at 11. Every day we're stating intentions, we're in effect making promises to people, and when we follow through on them and keep our word, we become predictable, we become trustworthy, and we build the social capital of trust. But you can see today, people don't keep their word. Their word is no longer their bond, and trust in all sorts of areas. Supremely, marriage and in public service is breaking down, even in this country. And trust is in deep disrepair. The third thing you see is the great gift is faith and freedom. The great weakness is we don't keep our word. The great requirement or a command is that covenants have to be passed on from generation to generation with a living tradition. As the rabbis point out, what does Moses speak about in the Passover? Hundreds of years of slavery, and tonight they're going free. Does he talk about freedom? No. They're about to go to the promised land of milk and honey. Does he talk about that great hope? No. Does he talk about the dangers of the howling wilderness? No. What does Moses talk about? Children. And of course, at the heart of the Seder, the youngest child. Why is this night different from all other nights? And you can see, as the rabbis point out, schooling is far more important to a free society than an army. Transmission is the key. Transmission is essential. And you can have all the powerful things in the world and lack transmission, and freedom will simply not survive. And both faith and freedom require transmission. Now, of course, we're in America in 2017. Is all that just a matter of history? One of the things we have to face very bluntly is that in key American circles, there's been a decisive repudiation of the founders and this understanding of the founding. You could deal with this in another whole section. I would just refer to certain things backwards, because it's the first one I think that's the most important. You can think of the progressives, from Woodrow Wilson to Barack Obama. The founders were great people, but men of their times, and we're in different times. Dean Acheson, the challenge of being an American statesman, he said after World War II, was to lead a nuclear power that was saddled with the constitution of an 18th century farmers' republic. And the progressives, by and large, are disparaging of the founding. Then, of course, you've got schools like Charles Beard and Parrington who say, today, with a quasi-Marxist view, we can see through what they were saying. They had an agenda, these Virginia tidal plantation owners and so on. But neither of those two are the fundamental reason the founders have been rejected, and that is the evils and hypocrisies of slavery. And as historians point out, sadly, the Constitution, for all its greatness, was a Faustian bargain. There were many who disagreed with slavery. There were some, like Samuel Hopkins, who spoke out robustly, but there were many who kept silent. Why? They needed the southern states to sign on, and silence was their compromise. And so there was both an evil and a hypocrisy at the very heart of the American experiment, in contradiction to the Declaration. And that, of course, while tackled by Lincoln in the Civil War at great cost, was still unaddressed and tackled by the civil rights, until finally it was lanced open by Martin Luther King and others. Now, of course, Martin Luther King tackled it both within a Christian framework and with an appreciation of the Declaration. So the Declaration gave a promissory note which wasn't cashed in, and now was the time to cash it in. But of course, in the context of the 60s, with the anti-Vietnam War movement, the rise of feminism, you had people who looked at those same evils and those hypocrisies and now pronounced that America was irredeemably, chronically racist and militarist and all sorts of things. And you can see that around 1967 or 68, there was in effect a fateful lurch left among many and an increasing number of the intelligentsia, which is surely why today the predominant mentality on most campuses, among many journalists, and certainly among many in the world of entertainment, reflects that same repudiation of the founders, which Shelby Steele has called the liberal shame about the founding, and so on. What does this mean today? Well, if we look at the history of covenantalism, you can see that we need first leadership. Again and again, when the Jews and others departed from the covenant, they were called back by great leaders. And that, of course, is what Lincoln tried to do. And you can see when he's elected president, he comes to Washington through Philadelphia and makes a great speech at Independence Hall and says, in effect, all my ideas come from the two documents from this building. And he finishes quoting Psalm 137. May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I am false to the ideals that have come from this building. So he comes to Washington in the terrible challenges of the time before the Civil War, and he tackles them in the light of what he knew of the American founding. We need a leader like that today. I've had the privilege of living in this city for the last 30 years. I can count on two thumbs, let alone less than one hand, the number of leaders I've heard who really bring in history with the understanding of a Lincoln today. I grew up under Winston Churchill. Almost all his speeches were seasoned with the perspective of history. But we need a leader today who can really address the present problems in the light of what he or she believes are the better angels of the American experiment, one of the crying needs of America. Secondly, there needs to be a profound clarification of freedom and the American experiment. In that fateful lurch leftwards, you can see that it's actually many of the ideas that come from not 1776, but 1789. Ideas from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, mediated through Nietzsche, mediated through Antonio Gramsci and his idea of the long march through the institutions, mediated through Herbert Marcuse in the 60s, and mediated through people in the postmodernist camp like Michel Foucault and his ideas that there's no truth, everything is power. And you can see that many of the leading ideas in America today are alien to the American Revolution, and they are the descendants and the heirs of the French Revolution, which means that while many Americans talk of freedom, actually they're talking about very, very different views of freedom. But the third thing that America quite clearly needs today is transmission. Without transmission, there's no passing on of the values, but without transmission, there's no identity. Without transmission, there's no binding unity. So the old American motto, e pluribus unum, after the 1960s, with all the stress on multiculturalism, diversity, it's all pluribus, there's no unum. In the 19th century, you could ask a group of school children, what were the uniting first principles that formed the unum, and people could give you maybe 10. I've asked students today, I've asked a group of CEOs today, sometimes they can't get beyond 1 or 2. Because the simple fact is that in many parts of this country, they've gone. The unum is fraying, and everything now pluribus, which is why Sam Huntington used to say, immigration puts more of a stamp on America than the revolution, because we've lost that sense of the unum being passed down. And you can see somewhere towards the end of the 60s, civic education disappeared from the public schools and is still absent today. Let me draw this to a close. Pass it over to Joe. Some simple points as I finish. First, while there's a lot of talk, even in the last fortnight in Washington, of democracy and the need for the renewal of democratic values, a lot of it, I would say, is windy platitudes. The issue in America is actually Republican covenantalism, constitutionalism, and all that it means in depth. It's not actually democracy. Secondly, the issue with Republican covenantalism, constitutionalism, is very simple. Should it be restored, including a remedying of some of the blind spots in the beginning, or is it about to be replaced? And ideas that come from the French Revolution, with the heirs and allies since then, are going to replace that, making America a very different place. Thirdly, the deepest issues, and I can say this at the Trinity Forum, I wouldn't argue this in some of the other places, the deepest issues are pre-political. Daniel Elazar, the great scholar who put this idea of covenantalism on the map and has been followed by Michael Walzer, Rabbi Sachs, and many, many others, Daniel Elazar said covenantalism came from the Middle East, and it came from a culture of oases. He said, if you look at a Middle Eastern oasis, none of them are ever larger or more luxuriant than one thing makes them, the wellspring at their core. And that, of course, is the secret of covenantalism. It, at the end of the day, is not legal. It is not political. At the end of the day, it is finally rooted in faith and people who know why the whole thing matters. Abraham Lincoln came here in the dark days before the Civil War, and he called, as you know well, at Gettysburg, for a new birth of freedom. We are living in darkening days. America may be suffering the most severe crisis since just before the Civil War. What America needs today is a new